All right, I believe you have a good break and you review the previous slides. So we'll start with the last few lecture slides from the previous lecture. Like our trachea is divided into right and left main bronchus, which is going to right lungs and the left lung. And we said right lung has 3 lobes, which is divided by 2 fissures, like horizontal fissures and oblique fissures. And on the left side, we only have 2 lobes divided by only 1 fissure, which is called oblique fissure here. And this is the cross section. This is posterior because you can see the vertebra. And this is the anterior because we can see the sternum. This is the right lung. This is the left lung. Our pulmonary artery, which is arising from the heart, is divided into right and left pulmonary artery. And our trachea is divided into right and left main bronchus. And the pulmonary veins, which is carrying oxygenated blood from the right lungs and the left lung coming back to the heart. And as you know, the whole area where the main bronchus, pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein going into the lungs, each lung, that is called hilum, or the root of the lung. Right, so that was where we stopped from the previous lecture. So now we need to talk about bronchopulmonary segment. That means bronchus, because it contains broncho and pulmonary mean lungs. So the portion of the lung with the its own bronchus, which is situated in each and every lobe of the lungs. So like this is a very free diagram, which is showing like our trachea is divided into right and left main or primary bronchus. It will go into the left lung and the right lungs. Yeah. So once it gets into the lungs, as we remember, on the right lungs, we have 3 lobes. On the left lung, we have 2 lobes. That means the main bronchus will split into 3 secondary bronchus. Here, one for the upper lobe, one for the middle lobe, and one for the inferior lobe. The same thing, like left main or primary bronchus, we divide into one for the upper lobe, which we call secondary or lower bronchi, and another one for the inferior lobe with the secondary or lower bronchi. And then once it has divided into 3 for the right and 2 for the left, again, it will further divide into the different segment of that particular lobe. So now, if we look at here, the trachea is divided into right main bronchus and left main bronchus. The main bronchus or primary bronchus, yeah? So in the right lung, we have 3 lobes. So one has to go to the superior lobe, one has to go to the middle lobe, and one has to go to the lower lobe. These division after the primary bronchus, let's call it secondary bronchus, yeah? Secondary bronchus to the superior lobe, secondary bronchus to the middle lobe, and secondary bronchus to the inferior lobe. And once it gets into the superior lobe, there are 3 segments in the superior lobe. So this secondary bronchus will further divide into apical and posterior and anterior segments. So these bronchus, they are called tertiary bronchus, which is going to the each and individual segment in the superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe. So the same thing keeps going on the left lung. And then we have like 3 segments for the superior lobe of the right lung, 2 segments for the middle lobe of the left lung, and the 5 segments for the inferior lobe of the right lung. And therefore, in total, there will be 10 segments, 10 bronchopulmonary segments in the right lung. The same thing goes on in the left lung. And for the left lung, as we know, we only have two. They are superior and inferior lobes. Therefore, the main bronchus will divide into two secondary bronchus for this, one for the superior lobe, one for the inferior lobe. And in the superior lobe, it has 5 bronchopulmonary segments. So therefore, the left secondary bronchus will divide into 5 tertiary bronchi. The same thing for the inferior lobe. So that means bronchopulmonary segment is the portion of the lung which is supplied by the specific segmented bronchus, which is the tertiary bronchus, and it has its own artery, vein, and lymphatics. In total, there will be 10 segments in the right lung and 9 segments in the left lung. This is the example. Like for the superior lobe, we have the apical lobe, posterior lobe, and anterior lobe. I'm not going to bore you with repetition. Right, so these are these bronchopulmonary segments, and the trachea divided into right main bronchus, left main bronchus. Right lung has 3 lobes, left lung has 2 lobes. In the superior lobe of the right lung, we will have 3 segments with its own bronchus. In the middle lobe, we will have 2 bronchopulmonary segments with its own tertiary bronchus, and in the inferior lobe, we have 3 segments with its own tertiary segment, and the same thing for the left lung. All right, that's about the bronchopulmonary segment. So I don't expect you to remember all the names of the bronchopulmonary segment, but I want you to have a broad idea about the bronchopulmonary segments and just roughly how many bronchopulmonary segments in each lobe of the lung. That's what I want you to concentrate on. Let's take a break before we go to the next slides. So I hope you have a good break. I hope you review the previous lecture slides. And now we talk about continuing and what's going on inside each and every bronchopulmonary segment. So our main bronchus for the left lung is divided into secondary bronchus for the superior and inferior lobe. That secondary bronchus we further divide into, let's say, for example, like 5 segments. So therefore, there will be 5 tertiary bronchi for the left superior lobe. And that bronchi, if you look at that, it still has got cartilage rings carrying from the trachea, and that cartilage will gradually disappear. And finally, these tertiary bronchus will divide, and finally it will become terminal bronchioles, little bronchioles, and finally we split into respiratory bronchioles. Hey, now these respiratory bronchioles will come and become dilated to form the alveolar sac. So alveolar sac is a combination of alveoli, so these are the little bubble-like structures, and the tubes going to the alveoli, which we call alveolar deck. So alveoli and alveolar deck contribute the alveolar sac, which is supplied by the respiratory bronchiole. So this is our heart. It's nice, easy to remember, which is interesting. So the blood from our right ventricle will come along the pulmonary trunk. We divide into left and right pulmonary artery that will go to the lungs. And now this pulmonary artery coming to the lung, and the arteries gradually get smaller and finally become capillaries. Look at the pulmonary capillaries, which are just wrapping around the alveoli, which are air-filled sacs. And then these alveoli, they are supplied by the respiratory bronchioles. And look at that here, elastic fibers. So elastic fibers also covering the alveoli. So that means alveoli can get stretched with the inhalation, the air coming into the lung, and the alveoli will contract and squeeze and get smaller inside because of the elastic recoils of the elastic fibers. So like at the alveoli level, inside the alveoli, we have air, which we inhale, and outside we have a meshwork of capillaries, pulmonary capillaries, and at the same time, we have elastic fibers. Now, pulmonary artery become pulmonary capillaries, and then get reoxygenated. There will be exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the alveoli capillary and alveoli level. And finally, these capillaries will merge together to form small arterioles, venules, and then finally pulmonary veins will return to the heart. So look at this alveoli, which is the each and every alveolus in singular form. Multiple alveolus will form alveoli. Look at the wall of the alveoli. They are very thin and flimsy. Yes, of course, the cells which is lining the alveoli is, yes, you don't know that, that is the simple squamous epithelium. So look at here, type 1 alveolar cell. Look at the type 1 alveolar cell. If you look at that, the cell is flat, and that is what we call squamous epithelium. So squamous epithelium line the alveoli. And look at the relationship with the artery here and the alveoli. So the arteries are very much closed with the alveoli wall. And at the same time, you can see type 2 alveolar cells. Look at this, which is colored with green. So now we know the alveoli has two types of cells, type 1 alveolar cells and type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cell is squamous epithelium, which is for the diffusion, filtration. Yes, type 2 alveolar cell, if you look at that, which is, it produces a special enzyme, which is called surfactant, which lubricate the inner surface of the alveoli, and it reduces the surface tension of the alveoli. Right, so now you have seen the detailed picture of the alveol, single alveolus, which is lined by the simple squamous epithelium. That cell is called type 1 alveolar cell. And now we can appreciate the type 2 alveolar cell, which is present in the wall of the alveolus, which secrete surfactant, and the proximity of the capillaries to the alveoli. So if we look a little bit more detail, as you remember, this capillaries, like their walls are made of, number 1, endothelial cell, and number 2, basement membrane only. Yeah, so if you remember, there are 3 types of capillaries. They are continuous capillary, fenestrated capillaries, and the sinusoidal capillaries. Yes, so these capillaries, if you look at that, you can see the endothelial cell here, and inside the capillary there will be RBC, which we call red blood cell, and this endothelial cell will be lined by the basement membrane. The same thing like in the alveolar wall. In the alveolar wall, we have the squamous epithelium, which is lying on the basement membrane. So now we have make another name, which we call respiratory membrane. Of course, on one side, we have the alveoli with its wall, and on the other side, we have the capillary with its wall. So they are fused together. That means we will have alveolar epithelium, which is made of simple squamous epithelium. We will have capillary endothelium, again, another made of flat squamous cell. And in between, we will have the basement membranes of these two epithelia. So fused basement membrane of the alveolar epithelium and the capillary endothelium. That is in combination we call respiratory membrane. And through the respiratory membrane, our oxygen will go from the alveoli side into the hemoglobin, and from the hemoglobin, carbon dioxide come out. And that there will be the gaseous exchange at the pulmonary alveoli level. That is the transfer of the gases at the alveolar level, and I hope you can appreciate the respiratory membrane. So now, how do we breathe? If we remember the thoracic cage, now you can see two muscles here, and we have the three muscles: external intercostal, internal intercostal, and innermost intercostal. So if you look at the external intercostal muscles, they are in between the ribs, and their direction is going downwards and medially, and internal intercostal is opposite, downwards and laterally. And if we remember this diagram, like this is the left rib, upper rib, lower rib, external intercostal is running downwards and medially, internal intercostal is running downwards and laterally, and innermost intercostal, which is running in parallel with the internal intercostal. And I hope you remember the neurovascular bundles underneath the every ribs. So, and this is the diaphragm, which is made of the fibromuscular structure. The centra is fibrous tissue, and periphery is the muscular tissue. And that's the diaphragm looking from the upper superior view, and the thoracic cavity, which we don't need to talk about. Right. So now we have completed the upper respiratory tract, starting from nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, and the pharynx, and part of the larynx, and lower respiratory tract, starting from the larynx and the vocal cord, and the trachea, dividing into right and left main bronchi, which we further divide into superior and inferior lobe of the lungs as secondary bronchi. These secondary bronchi we divide into tertiary bronchi for the bronchopulmonary segment, and now ends as the alveoli in the lung, and we have seen the thoracic cage and thoracic cavity. So again, like I want you to take a break and go back to previous slides. Now let's start again. So this is the thoracic wall and the lungs. Here, outer, we have the ribs here, like one rib, another rib, and another rib. And in between the ribs, we have the intercostal muscles here. And this is inside the thoracic cage, we have our lungs. For example, this is the right lung. So the same thing like heart, the heart is covered by the pericardium, and our lung is covered by the similar structure, which is called pleura. So pleura is two-layer structure. So the pleura will cover the lung substance, and it folds, and then it will reflect and come back and line the thoracic cage. So this is the pleura. The pleura, which covers the lung, is called visceral pleura, and the pleura, which covers the thoracic wall, it is called parietal pleura. So I hope you remember many names: visceral pleura and parietal pleura. Yeah. visceral pleura and parietal pleura. If you look at the visceral pleura, which is just significantly stacked close to the surface of the lung, and if you look at the parietal pleura, which is stacked on the inner surface of the thoracic cage. And now we have created a space, which is just a potential space, which is just a potential space, which is filled with pleural fluid, which is just thin and flimsy and just lubricate between two layers of visceral and parietal pleura. That is what we call pleural cavity. That is what we call pleural cavity. And now if we look at that, the surface anatomy, the heart, the lungs, and if you look at that, the pleura extend beyond the lung substance here. If you look from the front, the lung substance stop here, but the pleura extends anteriorly and it extends posteriorly as well. If you look at that, this is the end of the lung substance and this is the extension of the pleura. So pleura is larger than the lung itself. And therefore, when we inflate the lung with the air we breathe in, the lung has the space to expand inside the pleura. So now let's take a breath in. Easy breathing, quiet inspiration. So when we do the inspiration, which is effortless, quiet breathing, our inspiratory muscles, which includes external intercostal and the diaphragm. Normal quiet inspiration use external intercostal muscle and the diaphragm. So external intercostal muscle will contract, which pull the thoracic cage outwards and laterally and anteriorly. If you look at this diagram, external intercostal muscle, because of their pull, they will pull the rib cage outwards and laterally and anteriorly. At the same time, when the diaphragm contracts, the dome-shaped diaphragm becomes flattened. By doing so, that will increase the intrathoracic volume. And because of the increasing intrathoracic volume, the pressure inside the thoracic cage decrease. And in relation to the atmospheric pressure, that decrease in the pressure in the thoracic cavity draw air from the atmosphere, and the air can go into the lungs. And with quiet expiration, so what do you need to do? You just need to relax and stop the inspiration process. And inspiratory muscles relax, the diaphragm become dome-shaped, the rib cage becomes down as the external intercostal muscle stop contracting. That will reduce the thoracic volume. And there, as you saw, there are elastic fibers around the alveoli. They will contract and the lung will contract with the elastic required. And by doing so, that way, passively reduce the lung volume and the air pressure will push the air out of the lungs. So that is the normal quiet expiration. Yeah, so I believe you can appreciate the direction of the external intercostal muscle here. Once they contract, what happens? They will pull the rib cage outwards and laterally. So if you think about that, when the external intercostal muscles contracting, the rib cage being pulled outwards and laterally, at the same time, the sternum is pulling anteriorly. So that means like the rib cage being pulled from down here to upwards and laterally, that movement is something look like a Beckett handle movement here. And the same thing if we look from the side, because of the elevating ribs, we are pulling the sternum upwards here. And that looks like a pump handle movement here. So the both combination of Beckett handle and pump handle movement, they increase the anterior and lateral diameter of the thoracic cage. So I want you to remember pump handle movement and the Beckett handle movement of the respiration. So now this diagram is showing our pectoralis major. I hope we all remember that. Underneath the pectoralis major, we have the pectoralis minor, which is originating from the 3, 4, 5 ribs going to the coracoid process. And we have the sternocleidomastoid, which is coming from the sternum, which is coming from the clavicle going to the mastoid process. Why am I showing the sternocleidomastoid muscle? So once we become struggling with the respiration in inspiration, we have to recruit the other muscles which we attach on the rib cage. And therefore, during the effort inspiration, like those people who let asthmatic attack, which they struggle to do inspiration, they will be using the sternocleidomastoid and they will be using the pectoralis minor muscle. So this is the muscle of the back here. And the process of respiration, the process number one stage is to bring the atmospheric air into our lungs. That is what we call pulmonary ventilation, the air in and out of the lung. And number two step is that air in the alveoli need to cross the respiratory membrane so that oxygen can cross that membrane to get onto the hemoglobin. So that is what we call external respiration. And then the oxygen carrying hemoglobin need to be transported to the target organ cell. So that is what we call respiratory gas transport. And finally, the oxygen from the hemoglobin should be delivered to the cell itself. That happens at the capillary level. And that is what we call internal respiration. So these are the processes of respiration. But I want you to remember this another 4 steps. Let's start with the hypoxia and hypoxemia. These are the very common terms we use every day in the clinical years. Hypoxia means lack of oxygen in the tissue and cell level. Hypoxemia means a low oxygen level. Semia means blood in the blood. So it is slightly different. Yeah, hypoxia is the cell and tissue lacks oxygen. Hypoxemia means lack of oxygen in the blood. And I want you to remember there are 4 types of hypoxia, so which is pretty similar to the process of respiration here. The first type of hypoxia is hypoxic hypoxia. The atmospheric air we breathe in has reduced or no oxygen. For example, like when we climb mountains, hiking, when we get to the high altitude, there will be less oxygen in the atmospheric air. That is because we are breathing normally, the blood is being distributed normally, but the air we breathe in has low oxygen. That is what we call hypoxic hypoxia. Number 2 hypoxia is anemic hypoxia. Yes, the air we breathe in has good oxygen, but we do not have enough hemoglobin to carry that oxygen to the cell. That is what we call anemia-related hypoxia. It is anemic hypoxia. And number 3 type is stagnant hypoxia. So we breathe in good quality oxygen. That oxygen has been delivered to the hemoglobin and we have enough oxygen carrying hemoglobin, but the hemoglobin cannot go to the tissue because the arteries and the capillaries are blocked. For example, like heart attack, myocardial infarction. Yeah. So in myocardial infarction, the blood vessels are blocked, and that is what we call stagnant hypoxia. And finally, histotoxic hypoxia. We have delivered good quality oxygen being carried by hemoglobin, and the vessels are patent, and we got to the cell, but the cell cannot take that oxygen because the cell itself is damaged, which is histotoxic hypoxia, for example, like cyanide poisoning. So now let's go back to the respiration. Inspiration, as you know, we use diaphragm and the intercostal muscle. And diaphragm, this is diaphragm here, and diaphragm is when it is in a relaxed state, it is a dome shape. When it is contracted, it becomes flattened. Yeah, diaphragm is supplied by the nerve, which is called phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve arises from the cervical root 3, 4, 5. By contracting this diaphragm, flattens, it increases the vertical diameter of the thorax. We know that. And external intercostal muscles, intercostal nerve, they are supplied by the intercostal nerve. The contraction lift up the ribs, you know that already. It increases the anterior-posterior and lateral diameter of the thorax. Internal intercostal muscles, together with the external intercostal and innermost intercostal muscle, it stiffens the thoracic wall and it prevents the collapse of the thoracic wall. So actually, external intercostal muscles are contracting to move the ribs up and forward. By doing so, increase the size of the thoracic cage, negative intrathoracic pressure. And here I want to remind you, the lungs are directly connected with the atmospheric air, but pleura is not. Pleura is just the covering outside the lungs. So the air we breathe in, we stop at the alveoli level and in the lung substance, it will not go into the pleura in a normal situation. So now look at that. We have our lungs here, we have our pleura, which extend beyond the lung substance. And this is the posterior view. We have our lungs and the pleura will extend beyond. So that when we breathe in, the air in the lung expand, and there is a space for the lung to expand in the pleura. But let's say if we have to take a forceful inspiration, for example, like we are running, we are struggling, we are out of breath, our accessory muscles need to help. And these accessory muscles are sternocleidomastoid, we have seen it, pectoralis minor, we have seen this, so we need to go and see the scalene muscle. So look at the scalene muscle here. There are 3 scalene muscles, which are the anterior, middle, and posterior scalene muscle. They are hiding under the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And they come and attach to the first rib and the second rib. And therefore, anything come and attach to the sternum or the ribs, we have to help with the forceful inspiration. Yeah, they are sternocleidomastoid, scalene muscle, and pectoralis minor muscles. Expiration is a passive process. You know that. You just relax the muscle. There will be elastic recoil of the lungs. Yeah. Forceful expiration. Now you are squeezing out because of the blockage of the airway, for example, like bronchitis or asthma. The airways are narrow. The alveoli needs to squeeze out the air across the narrow airway. It is an active process. We have to use the abdominal muscles so that we are using our abdominal muscles to push the diaphragm upwards so that the thoracic volume reduce. And we have to use the abdominal muscle to press down the rib cage. So these are the abdominal muscles. They are again like external oblique, internal oblique, and transversus abdominis, 3 layers. So if we contract these layers, we push the diaphragm up, we pull the rib cage down, and by doing so, it further reduce the diameter and dimension of the thoracic cage. So now let's take a break. And I want you to go back and think about the previous lecture slides. So I hope you have a good break. Now let's talk about the alveoli. Yeah, as you know, the terminal bronchiole, respiratory bronchiole, and finally become alveolar deck and alveolar sac. And finally, this alveoli, individual alveoli, they are enwrapped with the elastic fibers. They are wrapped with the pulmonary capillaries for the gaseous exchange. The diameter of the alveolus, individual alveoli, is like 0.2 millimeter. They are very, very small structures. There are about 400 million of air-filled alveoli in our lungs. And because they are very small, their surface area is like 40 times greater than the surface area of skin. Therefore, there is a plenty large surface area where the pulmonary capillaries go and wrap around for the exchange of the oxygen and carbon dioxide. It is an amazing structure. Alveoli remain open at all times because if you look at the diameter of individual alveolus, it is like 0.2 millimeter. It is very, very small and tiny. But when it squeezes out the air, it remains patent, it remains open. Why does it happen? Because of the surfactant. You saw that surfactant, which is secreted by the type 2 pneumocytes in the alveolar cell. And it is just a phospholipid. It reduces the surface tension of the alveoli. Alveolus diameter, if we go back and study again, diameter 0.2 millimeter. There are about 400 million air-filled alveoli in our lungs. Its surface area is 40 times greater than the skin. It has got elastic fibers. There will be alveolar pores and alveolar macrophages. So this is the alveoli. I hope you remember this slide when we study about simple squamous epithelium. That is what we saw. And if we look and if we imagine and draw a diagram, this is the single alveoli. And in the alveoli here, we have the respiratory membrane. And the thickness of this respiratory membrane is like 0.2 to 0.6 micrometer. It is very thin, it is very flimsy, and therefore oxygen and carbon dioxide can cross this respiratory membrane. And as the pulmonary capillary cycle around the alveolus, and the blood which carries oxygen will cross here, the carbon dioxide will cross through the cell, type 1 pneumocyte here, which is the simple squamous cell, across the respiratory membrane. And here you can see the orange color-coded type 2 pneumocyte, which is for the surfactant. The air coming into the alveoli, oxygenated, and then now gradually re-oxygenated. The capillary blood will fill with more oxygen, become red, and there will be oxygen and carbon dioxide going in and out of the alveoli. So I think this is a very nice diagram. I want you to take your time to appreciate this diagram. And of course, if we take a step back out, that is what's happening is the alveoli, multiple alveolus, which we call alveoli, and multiple alveoli with the respiratory bronchioles, we call it alveolar sac. Control of the respiration. Control of the respiration is very interesting because respiration is a process which is happening without our conscious control, but at the same time, we can control our respiration as well. So like we can stop breathing to some extent, we can increase our breathing voluntarily, and therefore, and if we forget about everything, it is keep ventilating by ourselves. So that is a very interesting process. And therefore, it needs to be controlled with many different control areas. The first one I want you to remember is ventral respiratory group, which is located in the brainstem, which we call medulla. I hope you remember the brainstem, which is made of midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Yeah, three structures: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Ventral respiratory group of nuclei. So they control the involuntary respiration. At the same time, in our brain, in limbic region and hypothalamus region, it controls the respiration. It is related to emotion. So when we get excited, then this emotion can increase our respiratory rate. Then cerebral cortex, of course, it is our voluntary control. We can stop breathing for some extent. We can increase the breathing rate or depth of the rate. We are in control of our breathing, and therefore our cerebral cortex will play a role in respiration. And number 4, control of the respiration is our chemoreceptors. These are the receptors which detect the changes of the electrical hydrogen ions in our blood. So there are 2 chemoreceptors for the respiration. They are central receptors and peripheral receptors. Central receptors are present in the medulla here, and peripheral receptors are present in the aortic bodies and carotid bodies. So the control of the respiration is come by the ventral respiratory group here, ventral respiratory group in the medulla. And we also have pontine respiratory center, midbrain, pons. In the pons, we have pontine respiratory center, which will control the ventral respiratory group. And then that will come to our external intercostal muscles, and it will go to the diaphragm. So that means our brainstem, pons, medulla oblongata, they have nuclei of the nerve fibers for the respiration, and therefore the brainstem is very important for the respiration. The neural control, as you can see here, ventral respiratory group, pontine respiratory group center, ventral respiratory group center, which is again controlled by the pontine center. And here, ventral respiratory group, dorsal respiratory group, and they are all controlling each other. And therefore, ventral respiratory group is the pacemaker for the ventilation rhythm and rate. So neurons from the medullary respiratory center comes and go to the diaphragm as the phrenic nerve and go to the external and internal intercostal muscles as the intercostal nerves. So that is the nervous control of the respiratory system. So other structure that controls the respiration, of course, limbic. Limbic is the area in the brain and the hypothalamus. They are related to emotion, and this emotional changes can increase or decrease the rate and depth of the respiration. The other thing is voluntary, which is the cerebral cortex. Another thing is chemoreceptor. These are the receptor for the chemistry electrolyte changes, like change of hydrogen ion. These receptors are located in the medulla, which we call central receptor, or they will be related in the periphery, which we call aortic bodies and carotid bodies. So now let's look at the aortic bodies, which is just around the arch of the aorta. Look at that. Carotid bodies, they are at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery. Yeah, you can see the carotid body. So these are the chemoreceptor, which sense the electrolyte concentration in the blood, and they will detect and they will change the respiration. So now it's near end of the lecture. Let's talk a little bit about asthma. What is asthma? It is a reversible process. It's an intermittent small airway obstruction. It is not a large airway like larynx or trachea or main bronchi. It happens in the small airway, such as respiratory bronchiole, terminal bronchioles level. It is intermittent, often on. It can be reversible by something. The risk factors of the asthma: atopy, like allergy, family history, those people who smoke, those people who has high BMI, and of course, air pollution. They all play in asthma. The next medical issue is cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder. In cystic fibrosis, there are excessive secretion, which are viscous, very thick, and that blocks all the exocrine glands in the body. It is an autosomal recessive disorder. It's more common in Caucasians. There is a problem with the chloride and water transport, and therefore the nasal secretions, pancreatic secretions, they have less water content. They become very thick and very thick viscous secretion, and that will block the exocrine glands. If that, they can happen in respiratory tract, sweat glands, gastrointestinal genitourinary tract, and exocrine portion of the pancreas. So now look at the two X-rays, which is comparing normal chest X-ray and those people with emphysema. Yeah, if you look at the normal chest X-ray, like the diaphragm is dome-shaped here. Diaphragm is dome-shaped. Diaphragm inside the lungs are filled with air, and therefore it is dark color. When somebody have emphysema, the alveoli got damaged, distraction of the alveoli, and finally the lungs get expanded with the air, but damaged alveoli. And therefore, excessive air inside the lung that will push the diaphragm downward. So diaphragm become more or less flattened, and the shape of the lung is very much different, like a square shape here now. So excessive entrapping of the air in the lung, which is emphysema. Of course, finally, this is the last slide of the lecture, where I want you to remember the right lung has 3 lobes: superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe, which are divided by the horizontal fissure and oblique fissure. And in the left lung, we have only 2 lobes, superior lobe and inferior lobe, which is divided by the oblique fissure. And in the left lung, we have a notch area, which is called cardiac notch. Thus, we end the lecture of the respiratory system.